Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum at Cadence Independent Media. Today we are talking about one of my favorite things there is, really, and that's muffling. We're going to go with just snare drum muffling today and talk about what different methods work, how well they work, and what exactly they do to the sound. There's a lot of ways to muffle a snare drum. There's a lot of different materials that are used. Some of them are specifically for that, like the different gels and things like that are on the market. And I have three things that I like sort of better than anything else because of the exacting way that they change the sound of the drum. A lot of these are sort of studio specific, and I don't really use them in live situations because they're more subtle, which is why I use them. And we're going to just kind of go through the three methods that I like. And we're going to start with tape. Gaff tape is your friend. It's great for fixing broken stuff. It's great because you can just throw it in your bag and keep it with you all the time. I carry around a narrow, like a half-width roll in my cymbal bag all the time, just in case like there's a memory lock that's busted or something gets stripped out. But I also use it for muffling, especially in the studio. And the great thing about tape is that it's relatively inexpensive. You can keep a lot of it on you. It's also usually at studios if you're going to just show up and play and discover that the snare drum isn't working. And a little doesn't do that much to the drum, so you can go very stepwise in terms of how much you're taking out of the drum sound or how much you're changing it, which is why I don't tend to use gel products, because one of them already for me is a pretty dramatic change, and unless I want a really dramatic change, tape is just easier to deal with. It's also just straight up, if you're going to be cutting things up, like cutting gels up, I'd rather just be cutting tape up. So what we're going to do today, the way we're going to do this is we're going to start with the unmuffled drum, and we're just going to go through a groove repetitiously, adding one piece at a time. Now, the way that I like to do tape muffling rather than just flat on the head is to take a piece and put a little fold in the center of it like this. This does two things. The first thing is it makes it easy to get it back off of the drum once you put it on there, because there's a little handle that you can use to get it off. The other thing it does is it concentrates the weight of the tape in the center instead of it just being a flat mass that moves with the head. And this will have more of an impact on the sound than if you just lay tape flat on the head, because that will suppress a little bit of the high overtones, but it'll also move more freely with the head, and this is a little more of an effect. Now, where you put the tape on the head is also going to affect the way that this behaves. The high frequencies live at the edge of the head, and the low frequencies kind of live in the center. So if you want to not affect the overall sound too much, but you want to take some of the zing out of the high end, close to the edge is where it's at. And as you move toward the center, you're starting to get into affecting the mid-range more, and maybe even the low end. This is evidenced by how many center dot heads there are on the market that have an extra piece of Mylar attached to the head in the center. Think like Remo CS or, power centers, those sorts of things. These will boost the fatness at the center of the head by adding mass there, versus something like a Power Stroke or an EQ3, EQ4 kind of head where they add mass to the edge with a ring of plastic. And that will suppress high end, which also boosts the low end, but doesn't affect the attack so much. It leaves the attack kind of where it is. So here we go. Lots of tape. As you can see, things got dramatically different pretty fast. My least favorite was one piece of tape because It doesn't squash that much of the overtones, but it creates a weird sort of node on the head, like a heavy spot, that throws the tuning out of whack and makes the overtones super out of tune with each other. And it is actually kind of a cool effect sometimes. I've heard of people detuning a lug on a snare for that, almost the way that you would use distortion on a guitar to cut through a mix. A crunchy sounding snare drum will cut through a mix better sometimes if there's a lot of stuff in that same range than one that's tuned really pristinely. That's not something that I do intentionally, but I did notice it with that one piece of tape. My favorite spot was 3 pieces, which was actually surprising. I thought that 2 was probably going to do it, but after that third one went on there, it started to have that kind of muffled but still clear sound, and it fattened it up a little bit, lowered the fundamental of the batter head a little bit as well. Around 4 pieces, things start to get pretty dead. 5 pieces starts to feel like diminishing returns if you're trying to make it still sound like a snare drum. If you want a sort of almost electronic or like squashed kind of sound, or if you're going for minimal miking and you're going to compress the overheads aggressively, like a Glyn Johns kind of thing, then that's actually kind of great because those overtones are going to go wild in those mics once you start to compress them. So a lot of muffling on the snare and frankly on the toms for minimal miking situations can actually be really effective. Number 2, the One Ring, to rule them all. These are made by many companies. They come in a lot of different widths. This is a pretty narrow one, which is probably to me the most usable on a snare drum because it's not going to completely change the sound, but this definitely takes you directly to like Steve Gadd with Steely Dan kind of stuff, where it's articulation in the center of the head. It's not about a cracking backbeat. It's about a fat sound and an articulate sound. And regardless of how you tune your snare, this is going to make a huge impact on the sound. And I also know that people sometimes cut these up, or they'll just cut them out of an old head to use as a little edge ring. Sometimes you have to tape these down if you're playing really hard, or if your batter head is cranked down and your hoops aren't particularly tall. I've had them jump off before. So that's also something to think about. And this will be a shorter demo because it's either on there or it's not. Well, they do exactly what they say they do. They muffle the high end a lot. Now, thinking about what people were going for when they were using this sound, I'm going to play a little bit in the center of the drum and not catch the rim and see how that sounds. That feels a lot more like the sort of like late 70s or 80s studio sound that's punchy. It's really clean and clear. And they can turn it up in the mix and have it be present, but not super sharp. This sort of thing I also associate, with deader toms, maybe even like the hydraulic heads and people starting to move to smaller tom sizes. And, it screams, Gadd to me, basically. And the rim shot is okay, but the fatness in the center to me is kind of like what these are all about. And they certainly do that better than anything else. And it's nice and quick. And even like you can pull it off the drum in the middle of a song if you want to have the end of the song sound different because there's no adhesive involved. Unless you've taped it on. So yeah, super effective for that one thing. All right, number 3, which is my favorite and definitely the one I use the most, both at gigs and in the studio. And that is handkerchiefs. We have this delightful Evans handkerchief today. And the reason why I like these is because of the sort of levels of muffling that I can get without having to change too much. I actually bring 2 of these with me to gigs, especially if I'm playing backline kits, because I'm going to want one for the snare and also probably one for the floor tom, just available in case I need them. And I think most of the time people think of handkerchiefs on a drum as like draping it all the way over. And that's That's a sound. I mean, that's a dead sound. Like super dead. But that's not really the way that I use them. What I do is I fold them over into a triangle like this, and I lay it on the drum with the point facing away from me, and I find a lug, kind of grab, just like the underneath, the one thickness of it, and press a drum key over it to secure it. And then you can roll this up away from you for varying degrees of muffling, or you can throw it all the way off, but the drum key holds it on. And this is fantastic for me, particularly for singer-songwriter gigs or any situation where I'm going to need to play under instruments that are not very loud, or under vocalists where the lyrics are super important and it's sort of more like of a moody kind of vibe, where I don't want to overtake them with drum stuff. And this takes you there super quickly, and you can just tune it to how much or how little you need. So we're just going to kind of go through a few levels of this, the same as we did with the other things. A lot of sounds in there that are great. And I tacked on that little bit at the end with brushes on the train beat, because that's actually where I started doing this. Because just in the last few years, there have been a lot of singer-songwriters coming along that have more of like a Nashville influence, and they want to hear brushes. Not necessarily like a traditional train beat like that, but they want to hear brush grooves. And the first thing I noticed when I started doing brush grooves for that kind of music versus like playing jazz is that it was backbeat oriented, and that meant a lot of overtones, and it meant a lot of kind of space taken up between the strokes rather than just hearing the articulation. And to me, the sound of the train beat with the brushes kind of emulates the sound of the pick on the strings of the guitar. A lot of the times you're playing the exact same subdivisions, or you're emulating that kind of rhythm. And so that to me got me thinking about how a lot of times people will muffle the strings on the guitar with the back of their hand to get that articulation. And I wanted that same thing of not having to kind of fight the snare drum to stay under the music and stay out of the high end where the vocals live and where the guitar articulation lives. And instead kind of take up a low mid character where nothing else was living, because the bass is underneath it, the kick is underneath it, and then the keys and the vocal or the guitar kind of live above it. And I think I do this probably every time I play brush train beats, regardless of whether it's a recording session or a live gig. And it makes all the difference. And I have to say, like, a conversation I had last night at a gig came up, which is that the most valuable thing you can get as a player is a compliment from somebody who doesn't play drums. And there's one further than that, which is somebody who doesn't play any instruments at all. If somebody compliments your drumming who doesn't know anything about drums, that's huge. And if they don't know how to play any instruments at all, that's even crazier, because it means that whatever you did, it hit them like emotionally. And these little things can not so much define their experience, but it gives you the space to not be sweating the noise of your instrument, or, putting tape on your cymbal. Like, that's okay. You can do that. Putting a pillow on your bass drum, anything for you to be able to get out of the way of anything that's frustrating you about the sound. And with things like this, and we talked about it with bass drums too, there are these things that are not that invasive on your instrument that you can just tune your drum and then not worry about. You don't need to worry about messing with certain lugs. You don't need to worry about changing much from song to song. Like if I was not a drummer, I would hear those two sounds and think they were two different drums. And we didn't change any tuning anywhere in any of that. It was the same drum, the Supra, the whole time in the exact same tuning. And that's a lot of different drum sounds that didn't even require a drum key except to hold the hanky on. And again, I can't stress this enough. I don't consider muffling to be a substitute for tuning. I consider it to be a tool for once you've got a tuning that's working for what you're doing, because it's not going to make your drum do something that it's not already doing. It's just going to modify the sound. And when you see situations where people are doing extreme things to their drums to get a certain sound, rather than tuning them first, there are situations that warrant that, but they are the exception and not the rule. And I've definitely used some janky drums in sessions to get a certain kind of janky sound. But starting with the idea of know your instrument, tune your instrument, and then learn what different things will do to it, that's it, and it's a matter of following your ear. But don't think that just putting stuff on the drum is going to get you there. It's a Band-Aid at best. And the last thing, which is maybe probably the most well-known, is just putting your wallet on the drum. And we'll just do that real quick and call it a day. Yeah, the wallet, an oldie but a goodie. Probably the first thing I ever saw somebody put on a drum, and I still do it too. You've always got it on you. And I only recently got hip to the idea of like hanging it half on and half off. If you're playing really hard, it's probably going to fly off at some point. But that's definitely an option too. At the end of the day, all this stuff is pretty inexpensive. You maybe already have it. And if you like what you're seeing, please like, comment, subscribe. If you put anything weird on your snare drum that you didn't see here, we're always curious, I'm down to try just about anything. This is going to be the best part of the B-roll.